She had 30 seconds to say yes, or die in the snow. A woman with nothing left, a stranger with everything to offer, and a deal so cold it could have been the wind itself. This is not a love story, not at first. This is a story about survival, raw, desperate, and brutal. About what happens when you've lost so much that you'll shake hands with the unknown just to see one more sunrise. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far these mountains can reach. Now, stay with me, because part 1 begins in the worst moment of Eliza Hart's life. The snow didn't fall in Black Ridge so much as it attacked. It came in sideways, driven by a wind that had no patience for anything living. It found the gaps in coat collars and the splits in boot leather. It packed itself into the spaces between buildings and turned the main street into a long, pale wound running through the center of town. By the time January had settled in fully that year, the worst January in 30 years, according to anyone old enough to remember the last bad one, Black Ridge had become a place that was simply trying to kill you quietly, without any particular malice, the way cold always does. It wasn't personal. It was just what winter did out here. Eliza Hart hit the snow face first. She didn't fall gracefully. There was nothing graceful about being thrown out of a building by 2 men who smelled like sawdust and stale whiskey. Her right knee struck the boardwalk edge on the way down, and then she was in the street, hands sinking into 8 inches of packed white, the cold shocking the breath right out of her chest. For a moment, she just stayed there, palms flat in the snow, head down, breath coming in ragged pulls. Behind her, the door to the Copper Bell Saloon swung shut with a sound like a coffin lid dropping. "Don't come back." The voice belonged to Harlan Dodd. She didn't need to see him to know it. She'd spent the last 4 months listening to that voice. The way it went soft right before it turned mean. The way it always sounded reasonable 2 seconds before it wasn't. "You hear me?" I said, "Don't come back." Eliza pushed herself up. Her hands were already going numb. She got to her knees first, then 1 foot, then both feet, and she stood there in the middle of Black Ridge's main street while the wind did its level best to knock her down again. She didn't look back at the saloon. She'd made that mistake once already tonight, and looking back at Harlan Dodd's face had only made things worse. She had $4.11 in her coat pocket. She had the clothes on her back. A wool dress that had been respectable once, a coat with a hole in the left elbow, boots that let in water at the toe. She had no husband anymore. Thomas had been dead for 6 weeks, killed in a tunnel collapse 3 miles east of town, along with 7 other men whose families were now learning the same hard lessons Eliza was learning. The Silver Ridge Mining Company had sent a letter of condolence and a bill for the equipment Thomas had been issued. She still had that letter. She'd read it so many times the fold lines had gone soft and gray. She had no family within 300 miles, and she had a debt to Harlan Dodd, $42, borrowed over the course of a desperate autumn to keep herself fed and housed in the room above the saloon that he'd rented to her at rates that only made sense if you were already too scared to negotiate. $42 that she could not pay, that she would not be able to pay, that Harlan Dodd had decided tonight meant he was done waiting. Eliza took 1 step, then another. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a direction. She just knew that standing still in the middle of the street in this wind, in this cold, was the same as giving up, and she was not ready to give up. She didn't know what she was ready for. She didn't know what came next. She only knew that forward was better than stopped. The town was quiet in the way mining towns got quiet late at night. Not peaceful, not restful, just temporarily out of energy. The saloons were still lit. The boarding houses were dark. A horse stood tied to a post outside the assayer's office, head down, patient as stone. Somewhere up the street, a door banged open and shut in the wind over and over, a rhythm like someone knocking and never being let in. She passed the general store, past the barber shop, past the little building that served as both post office and telegraph station and was currently dark as a cave. The boardwalk ended at the edge of town, and then it was just the frozen road heading north toward the mine and south toward nothing in particular, and Eliza stood at that edge and realized she had nowhere to go. She sat down on the end of the boardwalk. The cold came up through the wood immediately. She could feel it through her skirt, through her petticoat, seeping into her bones with the patient thoroughness of something that had all the time in the world. She pulled her coat tighter. The hole at the elbow let in a thin knife of air. She put her arms around herself and looked out at the white nothing beyond the edge of town. Thomas. She didn't say it out loud. She just thought it, the way she'd been thinking it for 6 weeks. Not always as grief, sometimes as anger, sometimes as a kind of desperate plea sent to nobody in particular. Thomas, what do I do? Thomas, what do I do now? Thomas had been a good man, not a perfect man. He drank more than he should have, and he was terrible with money, and he had a habit of agreeing to things he couldn't deliver, which was how they'd ended up in Blackridge in the first place, chasing a rumor about a silver strike that had turned out to be exactly as reliable as most rumors about silver strikes. But he'd been hers, and she'd been his, and they'd been figuring it out together, and now she was alone in the cold at the edge of a town that had no use for her, and she was 24 years old, and she was going to freeze to death tonight if something didn't change. She was very calm about that realization. That frightened her more than the cold did. She didn't hear him approach. That was the first thing that struck her later, when she had the luxury of thinking about it, that a man that large should have made more noise. He was enormous. 6'3" at least, built like something that had grown up alongside pine trees and taken notes. Dark coat, dark hat, dark beard shot through with strands of iron gray, even though he couldn't have been more than 35. He moved through the snow like he'd been moving through snow his whole life, and had stopped noticing it. He stopped about 6 feet from her. She looked up at him. She was too tired and too cold to be properly afraid, which was probably the only reason she didn't bolt. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there in the wind and looked at her with dark eyes that were doing some kind of internal calculation she couldn't read. "You're going to freeze," he said finally. His voice was low. Not gentle exactly. There was nothing soft about the man, but not threatening either, just stating a fact. "I know," Eliza said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and looked back at the Copper Bell Saloon, as if he'd seen what had happened, or heard about it, or put it together from the fact of a woman sitting alone at the edge of town at 11 o'clock on the coldest night of the year. "You have somewhere to go?" "No." "Family in town?" "No." "Money?" She almost laughed. $4. He was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed between them. A loose shutter somewhere banged against a wall, over and over. "My name is Gideon Cross," he said. "I have a claim up in the mountains, silver. It's producing well." He paused. "I need a wife." Eliza stared at him. "I'm telling you that plainly," he said, "because I don't have time for anything that isn't plain. I've got a supply run to finish before this storm gets worse, and I need to be back on the mountain before morning. What I'm offering is this. I pay your debt to Dodd, tonight, right now. You marry me, legal and proper, before we leave town. You come up to the mountain, you help run the homestead." He stopped. "That's it. That's what I'm offering." "You're serious," Eliza said. "I don't say things that I'm not serious about." She looked at him, really looked at him. The set of his jaw, the steadiness of his eyes, the way he stood in the wind like it wasn't doing anything to him. She was a decent judge of people. Thomas had always said so. She'd learned it the hard way, growing up with a father who could charm anyone in the first 5 minutes and disappoint them in the next 5 years. This man wasn't charming her. He wasn't trying to. That meant something. She didn't know exactly what yet. "Why?" she said. "Why what?" "Why do you need a wife? A man with a working silver claim doesn't have trouble finding him." "I'm not looking for a certain kind of woman," he said, and there was something in his voice that closed a door firmly, but without anger. "I need someone who can manage a house, keep supplies organized, handle the things that need handling when I'm working the claim. The mountain is hard, the winters are long. I've been doing it alone for 4 years, and—" He stopped, seemed to recalibrate something. "I need a partner, not a companion. A partner." The wind hit hard for a moment, and Eliza's teeth chattered once before she got control of them. "I could be cruel," she said. "You don't know me." "True. I could be useless. I could be a liar." "Also true. You're taking an enormous risk." "So are you," he said. "More than I am." That was honest. She gave him that. She looked back out at the white darkness beyond the edge of town. $4.11, a hole in her elbow, a saloon owner who'd throw her out into the cold without losing a minute's sleep over it. A dead husband who'd left her nothing but debt and a letter from a mining company, and the memory of him laughing at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings when he was in a good mood. She was 24 years old, and she was going to die in this street. Or she was going to say yes to a stranger. "I need to know one thing," she said. He waited. "Will you hit me?" The wind was the only sound for a moment. "No," Gideon Cross said. And the way he said it, flat, immediate, like the answer didn't require any thought at all, was the only thing she'd heard in weeks that sounded entirely true. Eliza Hart stood up. Her knees were stiff from the cold, and she wasn't graceful about it, but she stood. She brushed the snow off her skirt with hands she could barely feel. She looked up at him. "All right," she said. "Let's get this done." Judge Harold Pickman did not appreciate being woken at 11:30 at night. He made this clear in several ways. The candle he carried to the door, the way his nightshirt was untucked and his hair was flattened on one side, the look on his face when he opened the door and found a large, dark-coated man and a snow-dusted woman standing on his porch. "Cross," he said, squinting. "Lord Almighty, what time is it?" "Late," Gideon said. "I need a marriage." Pickman looked at Eliza. Eliza looked back at him without flinching. "Is this—" Pickman started. "It's what it looks like," Gideon said. "She's agreeing of her own will. I'll pay your fee double for the hour." Pickman thought about this for approximately 4 seconds, then stood aside and let them in. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Eliza would remember almost none of it specifically. The cold parlor with its dying fire, the smell of tobacco and old paper, Pickman's tired voice reading the words with the enthusiasm of a man reading a grocery list, Gideon's hand next to hers on the Bible, large and rough and steady. She said "I do" when she was supposed to. He said "I do" when he was supposed to. Pickman signed the paper. Gideon paid him. Eliza signed her name. Eliza Cross, strange word, strange name, and then it was done. Outside on the porch, in the wind, with snowflakes catching in her hair, she was Eliza Cross, wife of a man she'd known for 40 minutes. She had some feelings about that. She kept them to herself. Hikung. Harlan Dodd was still awake when they came to the Copper Bell. He was behind the bar doing the accounts the way he always did at the end of the night. Ledger open, glass of whiskey at his elbow, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose that he'd never admit to wearing if anyone asked. He was a stocky man, Dodd, somewhere in his late 40s, with hands like river rocks, and the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and had curdled into something harder. He'd built the Copper Bell from nothing, and he wanted everyone to know it, and he ran it like a man who was still convinced the whole thing might be taken from him at any moment. He looked up when his door opened. He looked at Gideon. He looked at Eliza. Something shifted in his face. Not fear, not exactly, but something in the neighborhood of recalculation. "Cross," he said. He set down his pen. "Didn't know you were in town." "I'm not in town long," Gideon said. He walked to the bar. He didn't hurry. He put his hands on the bar top and looked at Dodd with an expression that wasn't angry, wasn't threatening, was just patient. The kind of patient that made you nervous. "Eliza Hart owes you money." Dodd looked at Eliza again. He seemed to notice something. The paper Gideon had placed on the bar, the one with Pickman's signature on it. He picked it up, read it. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. $42, he said. "That's what I hear." Gideon reached into his coat and produced a leather fold. He counted out bills onto the bar, slow and deliberate. 42. He paused. Plus 10. Dodd looked at the extra bills. "The 10 is for her things," Gideon said. "Whatever she left in the room, you'll pack them and have them brought out to the wagon in 20 minutes. That's not—" "She's my wife." Gideon's voice didn't change. It didn't need to. "You threw my wife into the street. I'm being reasonable about that because she's alive and unhurt. But we're going to be clear right now about what's going to happen next, which is that you're going to take this money and you're going to pack her belongings, and this is going to be the end of any business between your establishment and Eliza Cross. Clear?" The fire crackled in the hearth. Dodd looked at the money. He looked at Gideon Cross. He looked at Eliza, and she met his gaze and did not look away, and she saw something go out of his eyes, some assumption about her situation, about how this would all go, like a lamp being turned down. He picked up the money. "Clear," he said. Quotes. They loaded her things into Gideon's wagon in 17 minutes. Her things, one carpet bag containing 2 dresses, An extra pair of stockings, Thomas's pocket watch because she hadn't been able to leave it, a small book of poems she'd had since she was 16, a comb, and a photograph of her mother taken in 1871. That was everything Eliza Hart owned in the world. She put the carpet bag in the wagon bed alongside sacks of flour, salt, dried beans, hardware supplies, and 3 boxes whose contents she didn't know yet. The wagon was well made, and the horses were good. 2 big mountain-bred animals that stood in the cold without complaint while Gideon checked the rigging one final time. He helped her up onto the seat. Not effusively. He offered his hand, she took it, she climbed up. That was all. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and the wagon began to move. Blackridge slid past them. The dark storefronts, the lit saloons, the horse still tied outside the assayer's office. A man standing in a doorway watched them go. A dog barked somewhere and then went quiet. At the north edge of town, the road began to climb. Eliza looked back once. She wasn't sure what she expected to feel. Relief, maybe, or grief, or terror. She felt a complicated tangle of all 3 and a few other things she didn't have names for yet. The lights of Blackridge looked small already, swallowed by the dark and the snow. Thomas had died in the mountain 3 miles east of that town. She was now heading deeper into a different mountain with a man she'd married 45 minutes ago. What would you think of me, she thought at Thomas, if you could see this? She thought he might have laughed. He had that kind of laugh, surprised and genuine, the kind that came out before he could decide whether to let it. He would have said something ridiculous and slightly inappropriate and then squeezed her hand. She missed his laugh. She missed it like she missed the feeling of being warm. You should try to sleep, Gideon said beside her. I can't sleep on a moving wagon. Most people can't. He was quiet for a moment. But try anyway. It's 3 hours to the lower station. The lower station? There's a supply cache halfway up. We'll stop the horses there, transfer to the sled. The last part of the trail is too narrow for the wagon. She hadn't thought about that. She hadn't thought much about the practicalities of mountain at all. She'd been thinking about Survive Tonight and Don't Freeze and Who Is This Man? And now she was actually going up a mountain in a wagon in January, and the practical reality of that was starting to assert itself. How far is the homestead from the lower station? 2 hours by sled in good weather. And this isn't good weather. No. She looked at the road ahead, or what she could see of it, which wasn't much. The lanterns on the wagon threw a yellow circle that barely reached the tree line on either side. Beyond that circle, the darkness was absolute. Mr. Cross. Gideon. She paused. Gideon. What am I walking into up there? I want to know what to expect. He considered this for a long moment. Not evasively. She got the sense he was actually thinking about how to answer honestly rather than reassuringly. It's remote, he said. More remote than you're likely imagining. The nearest neighbor is 7 miles east. The nearest town, Carver's Junction, it's small, is 12 miles down the South Trail. When the weather is bad, it might as well be 100. All right. The homestead is built well. It's warm. There's food stored and more coming up with this supply run. I'm not asking you to live in hardship. But the mountain is the mountain, he said. It doesn't care what you need from it. It doesn't make exceptions. If you go out in a bad storm without proper gear, you die. If you let the woodpile get too low, you freeze. If you're not paying attention to where you're walking in the dark, he stopped. You have to learn it. The mountain, its rules. I'll teach you what I know. Eliza was quiet. I should tell you something, she said. He looked at her sideways. I've never been afraid of hard work, she said. I grew up on a farm in Ohio. My father was not a man who believed in women sitting still. I can cook, I can preserve, I can keep books, I can do basic carpentry repairs. I'm not delicate. She paused. But I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to do things wrong while I learn. I need you to tell me when I'm wrong without, I told you I wouldn't hit you. I know, I mean without contempt. She said it quietly, but without hesitation. I can take correction. I can't take contempt. I won't be able to function under contempt. He was quiet for a long moment. Fair enough, he said. The wagon climbed. The wind came and went in gusts, hitting the tree line and breaking into something almost manageable before gathering itself and trying again. The horses moved steadily. Gideon held the reins with an ease that came from doing something 1,000 times. the kind of ease that stops looking like skill and starts looking like nature. Eliza pulled her coat tighter and watched the dark road unreal in front of them. She was not all right. She was not fine. She was very far from both those things. She was a widow 4 hours past being thrown into a snowdrift who was currently riding up a mountain in the dark with a stranger she had married in a borrowed parlor while wearing a dress with a hole in the elbow. She had $4.11 and a carpet bag full of small things and a pocket watch that didn't belong to her anymore and a name she hadn't had this morning. But she was moving. She was alive. She was moving. That was something. That was enough for right now. That was everything. The lower station appeared out of the dark, like something that had been waiting there patiently for them. A solid-built log structure, small but sturdy, positioned where the wagon trail ended and the mountain trail began. A lean-to on the side held a sled and the rigging for it. A separate small outbuilding, she'd learn later, held emergency supplies locked under a heavy padlock. Gideon pulled the horses up and climbed down with the same economy of movement he did everything with. He lit an additional lantern from the wagon, hung it on a hook on the outside of the station, and began transferring supplies to the sled. Eliza climbed down and went to help. He looked at her. Not surprised exactly, more like he'd been waiting to see if she would. "The flour sacks are heavy," he said. "I can see that." She picked up a flour sack. It was heavy. She staggered slightly, adjusted, and got it to the sled. Gideon watched her for 1 second and then went back to his own work without comment. They transferred supplies for 40 minutes. The wind was worse at this elevation. It came off the upper slopes with a viciousness that the trees only partially blocked, finding its way through every gap in her clothing and doing its work methodically. Her fingers went to a kind of desperate, painful, clumsy state that was technically still functioning but required significant concentration. She kept moving. She didn't say anything about her hands. When Gideon handed her a pair of heavy work gloves from a hook inside the station door, she put them on without a word and went back to work. When the sled was loaded, he hitched the team horses to the post inside the lean-to with feed and blankets. They'd stay there until he came back for the wagon. He helped her onto the sled, that hand again, steady, and climbed up himself and took the reins, and the mountain opened up in front of them. What Eliza would remember later about that ride up the mountain, not the whole thing, because exhaustion had started to take pieces of the night from her, wearing away at the edges of her attention, was the silence, not an absence of sound. The wind was constant, the runners hissed on the packed snow, the horses breathed in great steaming clouds. But underneath all of that was something else, a profound stillness that sat in the spaces between the trees like it lived there, had always lived there, was not bothered by any of them. She had grown up in Ohio, with its wide-open fields and the sound of wind that had nothing to interrupt it. She had lived in Blackridge for 4 months, with its constant noise of men and machinery and commerce and complaint. This was different from either of those things. This was a silence that felt ancient. She found herself, somewhere in the second hour of the sled ride, sitting up slightly straighter and looking at the trees going past on either side. The pines enormous and dark, their lower branches ghosted with snow, the occasional open space where the mountain fell away and she could see, really see, for a dizzying moment, how high they were, how far the lights of the valley lay below, how enormous and indifferent the sky was above. She didn't say anything. Neither did Gideon. But at some point, without quite meaning to, she had stopped hunching against the cold and started actually looking at where she was. The homestead came into view through a break in the trees, and Eliza's first thought was, "That's much bigger than I expected." She had built an image in her mind during the ride up. A cabin, small and rough, the kind of place a solitary man would build if he wasn't expecting company. What she saw was not that. It was a proper structure. 2 stories, she thought, though it was hard to tell in the dark. Built from timber that had been hewn and fitted with real craft. A covered porch ran the length of the front. There were shuttered windows on both visible sides. A separate building to the left, the barn, she'd learned, was nearly as large as the main house and showed light between the boards where the animals inside were generating warmth. There was a chimney. There was smoke coming from it. "You have someone up here?" she said. "Billy Crane," Gideon said. "Works the claim with me. Lives in the room off the barn." He pulled the sled up near the porch. He would have banked the fire before dark and put the food on low. You were expected tonight. Weather dependent. He knew I'd be back before the storm broke. He climbed down and began unloading. Go inside, warm up. There should be stew on the stove. Eliza looked at the house. Then she looked at Gideon, already moving supplies with that same steady, tireless efficiency, like a force of nature that had simply been redirected toward a practical task. She thought about everything she had said yes to tonight. The debt paid. The cold street left behind. The $4.11 in her pocket, which she could keep now, which was a luxury she hadn't expected. The name on the paper that said Eliza Cross in her own handwriting. She thought about Thomas and the way she'd last seen him, kissing her cheek before the morning shift, his hand warm on the back of her neck for just a second before he let go and walked out the door. She thought about how ordinary that had seemed, how utterly unremarkable the last moment always is until you know it's the last one. I'm going to figure this out, she told him, in the wordless way she'd been talking to him for 6 weeks. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to. She walked up the porch steps, opened the door, and went inside. The inside of the house hit her like a physical thing, warmth, actual warmth, the kind that had weight to it, that pressed against the cold she'd been carrying in her bones for the last several hours, and began, slowly, to push it back. The main room was large. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and beside it an iron stove with a pot on it that smelled like venison and onion and something smoky and warm. A table, solid and scarred from use. 4 chairs. A shelf of supplies along one wall. Lanterns. A second shelf with a few books she couldn't read the titles of from here. It was not pretty. It was not decorated. It was entirely functional and maintained with a thoroughness that said whoever kept it cared about its usefulness, even if they didn't care about its appearance. But it was warm, and it was solid, and it didn't smell like spilled whiskey and other people's cigarettes, which the copper bell always had. Eliza took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door. She found a bowl on the shelf, ladled stew from the pot on the stove, sat down at the table, and ate. She ate all of it. Then she sat for a moment with her hands wrapped around the empty bowl, letting the warmth of the ceramic work into her fingers. Then, because she needed to keep moving or she was going to sit down somewhere and fall apart in a way that wouldn't help anyone, she got up and found where the dishes were kept and washed her bowl in the basin. She was still doing that when Gideon came in with the first load of supplies. He set them down on the table and looked at the pot on the stove, then at her at the basin. You ate, he said. Not accusatory, just noting. I hope that was all right. I told you to warm up. I did both. He made a sound that was almost, she wasn't sure, almost something. He went back out for another load. By the time all the supplies were inside and sorted and the horses were put up in the barn, it was past 3 in the morning. Eliza had, without exactly deciding to, reorganized the supplies as Gideon brought them in, dry goods together, hardware separate, the medicines and salves in their own section on the high shelf. When Gideon came in with the last load and found this in progress, he stopped for a moment. You didn't have to do that. I could see where things belonged. She lifted a tin of coffee, raised an eyebrow and a question. He pointed to the high shelf, second section. She put it there. The bedroom is up the stairs, he said, but first door. I'll take the... You should have the bedroom, she said. I'll sleep down here. It's your house too. That hit her oddly. She looked at him, and he looked back at her. And there was a moment where some negotiation was happening without words, both of them figuring out a geography for this strange arrangement they'd walked into. There are 2 rooms upstairs, he said. The second one was a storage room. There's a cot in it that's comfortable enough. You can have either one. I'll take the second room, she said. He nodded. Get some sleep. He moved toward the stairs, stopped with one hand on the newel post, and didn't quite turn around. You did all right tonight, he said. Getting up the mountain, the unloading. A pause. A lot of people would have been more trouble. It wasn't exactly a compliment. It wasn't warm or florid, or the kind of thing anyone would write poems about. It was just a flat statement of fact from a man who appeared to deal primarily in flat statements of fact. Eliza surprised herself by finding it one of the better things anyone had said to her in recent memory. Good night, Gideon, she said. Night, he said, and went upstairs. She lay on the cot in the second room, cold at first, then warm as the wool blankets she'd piled on top of herself did their work, and looked at the dark ceiling and listened to the wind outside trying to get in and failing. The house held. This is your life now, she thought, not with grief, not with fear, just with a kind of bare factual clarity, the way you see things at 3 in the morning when there's no energy left for anything else. This is what you chose, what you had to choose. This is where you are. She found Thomas's pocket watch in her carpet bag by feel, in the dark, and held it in her palm. It had stopped. She'd meant to wind it and kept forgetting in the chaos of the last weeks. Cold and stopped and still in her hand. She thought about Blackridge and the cold street and Harlan Dodd's face when he understood that the thing he thought he owned had walked out the door. She thought about Gideon Cross, who had appeared out of a snowstorm and made her an offer that shouldn't have made sense but did, who had spoken to her like a person throughout, who had said you did all right in a voice that didn't know how to be anything other than honest. She thought, I don't know this man. She thought, I need to learn him. She thought, I don't know this mountain either. She thought, I need to learn that too. The wind hit the shutters and pushed and found no way in. Somewhere below, the stove ticked as it cooled. The house was dark and cold and full of strangers, including herself. Eliza Hart, Eliza Cross, closed her eyes. She did not expect to sleep. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She woke up not knowing where she was. That first second, before memory caught up with her body, was almost peaceful. The ceiling was unfamiliar wood, rough-hewn and dark with age. The blankets were heavy. The air smelled like pine resin and cold ash and something faintly metallic that she'd learn later was the mountain itself, a particular mineral smell that came up through the ground in winter. Then everything came back. All of it in the span of a single breath. She lay still for a moment and let it settle. Then she got up. The floorboards were cold through her stockings. The small window in the storage room showed pale gray light, early, maybe 7, maybe earlier. She could hear wind, but softer than last night. She dressed quickly, ran the comb through her hair, pinned it back with the 3 pins she'd managed to keep track of, and went downstairs. The fire was already going. Gideon was at the table with a mug of something and a piece of paper he appeared to be studying. He looked up when she came down the stairs, then looked back at his paper. He'd been up for a while. There was a skillet on the stove with the remnants of eggs in it, and a second plate covered with a cloth that turned out to be her breakfast kept warm. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, looking at the covered plate. You didn't have to, she started. I was already cooking, he said, not looking up. Didn't make sense to make 1 plate. She sat down and ate. He kept reading his paper. The fire talked to itself in the hearth. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. It was the strangest morning of her life, and also, in some way she couldn't entirely explain, the quietest. When she'd finished, she cleared both their plates without being asked and washed them at the basin, and then she turned around and said, Tell me what needs doing. He looked up then. Looked at her with those dark, evaluating eyes. Today you learned the layout, he said. House, barn, outbuildings, the trail markers. You don't go past the markers without telling me first. The mountain's bigger than it looks. All right, Billy will show you the barn animals. 3 horses, 2 milk cows, chickens. Can you milk a cow? I grew up on a farm. Right. He folded his paper. This afternoon I need to get back to the claim. There's a vein we've been working and the ground shifts after a big storm. I'll be back before dark. A pause. If I'm not back an hour after dark, you and Billy don't come looking. You stay here, you keep the fire, and you wait. She noticed the way he said that. Not casually, but deliberately, as if he'd had to learn the hard way that this instruction needed stating out loud. Has that happened before? She asked. You not making it back? Once? He stood up. I made it back. He said it in a way that closed the subject without slamming it, and she let it close. Billy Crane turned out to be 17 years old. She hadn't expected that. She'd built an image from the word works the claim. A weathered man, probably. The kind that drifted from camp to camp following silver and whiskey in roughly equal measure. What came through the barn door that morning was a lanky boy with ears that were slightly too big for his head and a wool hat pulled down so far it nearly covered his eyebrows. stomping snow off his boots and stopping dead when he saw her. He looked at her, looked at Gideon, looked back at her. "Huh," he said. "Billy," Gideon said. "This is Eliza, my wife. She needs to learn the barn." Billy's mouth opened, closed. He seemed to be having a significant internal experience. "Your wife," he said. "That's what I said." "Since when do you have a—" "Since last night," Gideon said, with the particular patience of someone who had spent significant time managing a 17-year-old. "Show her the animals, the full rotation. Don't skip the thing with the gray mare's left shoe." "What thing with the—" Billy started, and Gideon was already walking away toward the claim trail, and Billy turned back to Eliza with an expression that was somewhere between stunned and delighted. "He just does that," Billy said. "Walks away in the middle of things. You'll get used to it." "I'll take your word for it," Eliza said. "Show me the barn." She liked Billy Crane almost immediately, which she hadn't anticipated needing to do. He talked constantly, filling every silence with information, opinions, half-finished stories, and questions he sometimes answered himself before she could. He'd been working with Gideon for 2 years since he was 15, when his family's claim 3 mountains over had collapsed financially, and his father had sent him to find wage work rather than watch him starve at home. Gideon had hired him for the horses initially because Billy had a way with animals that was close to uncanny, and kept him on for the claim work when it became clear he was reliable and smart under all the noise. "He doesn't talk much," Billy said, pitching hay into the gray mare's stall with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Cross. In case you hadn't noticed, he'll go 2-3 days sometimes without saying more than what's needed. He's not mean about it. He's just—" Billy paused, searching for the word. "Internal. Like most of his talking happens somewhere you can't hear it." "How do you know what he needs, then?" "You watch," Billy said simply. "He's real easy to read once you stop waiting for him to say things." He glanced at her sideways. "How'd you end up married to him? If you don't mind me asking, you don't have to say." "He offered to clear my debt, and I was about to freeze to death in the street." Billy considered this for a moment. "That's the most Mr. Cross way that could have happened," he said, with what seemed like genuine admiration. The barn tour took 2 hours. By the end of it, Eliza knew the names, temperaments, and particular complaints of every animal under that roof, including the gray mare's left front shoe that was wearing unevenly and would need attention before the next hard run, and the smaller of the 2 milk cows who would only let herself be milked if you came at her from the right side and didn't rush the first contact. Small knowledges, the kind that kept things alive. She spent the rest of the morning inside learning the house. It was more organized than it looked at first glance. Everything had a place, and the place had a logic to it that she could figure out once she looked for the logic instead of imposing her own. The supply system made sense for a man who had to plan months ahead, who couldn't run to a store when he ran out of something. The tools were kept with a carpenter's precision, each one clean and in its designated spot. The books on the shelf, 11 of them, she counted, were a strange collection. 2 surveying manuals, a thick volume on mining engineering, a medical reference book so well used the spine had cracked and been repaired with leather lacing, a battered collection of Shakespeare plays that looked like it had been read many times, and several others on subjects ranging from metallurgy to timber management. She ran her finger along their spines and thought about the man who'd chosen them. Not a man who read for pleasure, or not only. A man who read because he needed information, who took the mountain seriously as a problem to be understood. She opened the medical reference book. Several pages had been dog-eared. Several passages were marked with penciled lines in the margin, clean, careful lines, not scrawled. She read a few sentences of the marked passages, then closed the book. She put it back on the shelf where she'd found it. Then she stood at the window and looked out at the mountains, the pines running up the slope, the claim trail disappearing into the trees, the gray sky sitting low and heavy and patient over all of it. And she said quietly to nobody, "All right." Then she went to figure out what was available for dinner. Gideon came back 2 hours before dark. He was quieter than usual when he came in, which she was beginning to understand was its own language. Billy had told her, when he comes in quiet, something didn't go right at the claim. Don't ask directly. He'll talk about it when he's ready, and if he's not ready, he'll go chop wood and work it out. Sure enough, within 20 minutes of arriving, Gideon was outside splitting logs with an efficiency that was almost alarming, each stroke clean and final. The pieces flying apart with that particular sound that is somehow both violent and satisfying. She had stew ready when he came back in. He sat down and ate without ceremony, and she sat across the table and ate too, and there was quiet between them that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was not yet comfortable either. It was the quiet of two people learning each other's distances. After a while, he said, "There was a cave-in at the secondary shaft. Nothing serious, nobody hurt. But we lost 2 days of work." "I'm sorry," she said. "It happens." He turned his mug between his hands. "It's good silver. The vein runs deeper than I thought when I first staked the claim. Takes patience. How long have you been working this claim?" 4 years. He paused. "I came up here after—" He stopped, and there was something in that stop that she didn't push. 4 years, he said again. "I know this mountain." She nodded and didn't ask about what came before 4 years. He didn't ask about Thomas. They were both carrying things they weren't ready to put down yet, and somehow, without discussing it, they understood that about each other. It wasn't warmth, not yet, nowhere near warmth, but it was something like recognition. The first week was mostly hard. Not dramatic hard, not crisis hard. Just the grinding daily hard of learning an entirely new way to live, of making mistakes that cost time and energy she didn't have to spare, of muscle soreness from work that used her body differently than any work she'd done before. The cold was the thing she struggled most with, in ways she hadn't expected. Not the cold outside, she'd known about that and prepared herself mentally. It was the way the cold infiltrated everything, the way it was present in the house, even with the fire going, sitting in the corners and rising from the floor and finding you the moment you stepped away from the stove. She woke up cold. She went to sleep cold. She worked through a persistent low-level cold that never quite went away and had to be managed rather than defeated. She burned the bread the first 3 times. The oven in the mountain house ran hotter than she was used to, and the difference between not yet and too long was about 2 minutes narrower than any oven she'd cooked in before. The 4th time she got it right, a solid, imperfect, somewhat lopsided loaf that was nonetheless cooked through and not charred on the bottom, and she felt a disproportionate satisfaction that she kept entirely to herself. Gideon noticed. He ate 2 slices at dinner without commenting on the previous 3 failures, and that was somehow exactly right. She got lost once, at the end of the first week. It was her own fault. She'd gone out to check on the cows in a light snowfall that turned into something heavier while she was in the barn, and on the way back she took what she thought was the path to the house and ended up in the trees on the north side of the homestead, disoriented in a way that happened fast. The way disorientation on a mountain always happens, Billy had warned her, between one step and the next, the familiar landmarks suddenly rearranged by snow and shadow and a sky that looked the same in every direction. She stopped. Forced herself to stop, which went against every instinct that was saying move, keep moving, find it. She stood still and listened and looked and made herself think instead of panic. She found the house in 8 minutes by following the sound of the chimney smoke. Not the smell, which the wind was scattering, but the faint creak and pop of the flue that she'd learned the rhythm of from inside the house. She came around the back corner of the building and almost walked into Gideon, who was standing on the back porch with a lantern and a coat half-buttoned, looking out toward the tree line with expression she didn't have a name for yet. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment. "I got turned around," she said. "I found it. I was about to—" "I know. I found it." She met his eyes steadily. "I won't panic on the mountain. I promise you that." Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, something quieter than relief. "The smoke from the flue," he said. "Yes. That's how I found my way back my first winter up here." He said it straight, without self-consciousness, just offering it. It makes a sound when the wind hits it a certain way, like knuckles on wood. She'd heard exactly that. She nodded. He held the door open. She went inside. He went back to banking the fire without saying anything else, and she changed out of her wet outer things, and neither of them mentioned it again. But something had shifted between them. A small thing, like a door that had been stuck giving slightly in its frame. Not open, but no longer entirely sealed. In the second week, she started finding a rhythm. She took over the household accounts, found Gideon's ledger, kept in an even, precise hand that surprised her, and spent an evening reviewing the last 6 months of entries. He tracked everything: supply costs, timber sales, silver yields, labor costs for Billy, equipment repairs. The records were thorough, but the organization was functional rather than efficient. She'd grown up watching her mother keep the farm books and had a head for numbers that Thomas had always teased her about, calling it her most unromantic quality in a tone that meant it was actually one of the things he loved. She spent 2 hours one evening restructuring the ledger system into something that would be easier to read at a glance, particularly for comparing month-to-month yields. She put it back on the shelf and didn't say anything about it. 2 days later, she came in from the barn to find Gideon sitting at the table with the ledger open, running his finger down the new columns. He looked up at her. "This is different," he said. "I reorganized it. The system before was accurate, but no." He looked back down at it. "I mean, it's better. This is better." He turned a page, then back. "The comparative columns. I've been doing those calculations in my head every time. This saves—" He stopped. "Thank you." She hung her coat by the door. "You're welcome." It was not a turning point. She'd learned to be suspicious of anything that felt like a turning point in those early weeks. The mountain had a way of following small progresses with large setbacks, keeping you humble about what you thought you'd figured out. But it was a moment, one of a series of small moments accumulating like snow. Each one light, each one easy to brush away, but building into something with real weight. Billy caught her crying once, in the 3rd week. She was in the tack room at the back of the barn, supposedly oiling a harness, and something had arrived in her out of nowhere. Grief worked like that, she'd learned. It hid in ordinary moments, and then came at you sideways. She'd been thinking about Thomas's pocket watch sitting in her carpet bag upstairs, still stopped, and then she'd been crying before she'd made any decision about it. Billy backed out of the tack room very quietly. She heard his footsteps retreat. 20 minutes later, when she came out of the barn with dry eyes and an oiled harness, he was where he usually was, not looking at her with deliberate casualness, and he said, "I figure you want stew again tonight, or should we try something different with the dried beans?" "Stew is fine," she said. "Stew it is," he said, and kept walking, and that was the whole of it. She liked Billy Crane. She liked him more and more as the weeks passed, and she understood him better. The good-natured noise of him covering something quieter underneath, the way he watched out for things without ever making a production of it, the particular loyalty he'd developed for Gideon that read as something close to what a boy gives a father figure when the actual father was not up to the job. He'd been up here 2 years, and he knew the mountain in his bones, and he passed that knowledge to her in the same cheerful, constant stream he passed everything else, without condescension, without drama. She and Gideon did not have what anyone would call conversations in those early weeks. They had exchanges, functional, necessary, sometimes running longer than strictly functional, when one of them said something that required a real answer rather than a practical one, and then stopping when the real answer had been given. It was more than she'd expected, less than she'd admitted, somewhere private that she'd hoped for. He was not easy to know. He was not trying to be difficult. She understood that. He simply operated at a remove from people that had become structural, built up over years of being alone on a mountain, layered into the way he moved and spoke and occupied a room. He was considerate in practical ways. He never asked her to do something he wouldn't do himself. He maintained the machinery of the household with a thoroughness that made her job easier. He was always where he said he'd be and back when he said he'd be back. He kept his word as if it was the one currency he refused to devalue. But there were evenings when she sat across the fire from him and felt the distance between them as something almost physical, something with texture, and she thought, I don't know if this ever gets smaller. I don't know if he knows how to let it. Then there was the night with the wolf. It was in the 4th week. A sound woke her. Not the wind, not the house settling, something else. Low, intermittent, coming from somewhere down near the barn. She lay still and listened, and after 30 seconds she'd identified it. One of the horses, kicking the side of its stall. Distressed, not injured. Something had the animal spooked. She was dressed and downstairs before she'd consciously decided to go, moving on the same instinct she supposed farmers always developed for the sounds of distressed animals in the night. She got her coat and the lantern from the hook. Gideon was already in the main room. He had his rifle. "Stay here," he said. "What is it?" "Wolf, probably. They come down when it gets cold enough, and the deer are scarce." He checked the rifle, a motion so practiced it barely required looking. "Stay inside." She stayed inside. She listened to him go out, heard the door close, heard his footsteps cross the porch, heard nothing for a long time. That deep mountain silence that now, 5 weeks in, she was beginning to interpret rather than just experience. She heard the wind. She heard distantly the horses still moving in the barn. Then, one shot. Then silence again. 20 minutes later, he came back in, stamping snow off his boots, setting the rifle on its rack. "One wolf," he said. "Young. Probably separated from the pack." He paused, something moving across his face. Not regret exactly, but something in that family. Wouldn't have come down otherwise. He said it the way people say things when they've done something necessary that they don't particularly like doing. When they've been around enough hardship to know that necessary and good aren't always the same. Eliza had not expected that flicker of something complicated in his face. It stayed with her. She thought about it later, lying in her room listening to the wind. The way he'd said wouldn't have come down otherwise, as if the wolf's reasoning mattered to him even after the fact, as if he wanted something to understand what had forced his hand. She thought, there is more in there than he shows. She thought, you already knew that. She thought, you're going to have to be patient. Patience had never been her strongest quality. Thomas had always said so, with that particular affection people put in observations about your flaws when they've decided to love you anyway. She was a person who wanted to know things, to understand them, to get to the truth of a situation as quickly as possible, rather than circle it for weeks. But she was on a mountain in a winter that wasn't going to end for months. She had time. And she was learning, slowly, the mountain's own lesson. That some things couldn't be rushed. That the ground gave up its silver in its own time, and pushing it only caused cave-ins. She turned Thomas's pocket watch over in her hand in the dark. Then she set it on the small shelf by the cot and wound it. It was a small decision. She wasn't ready to stop holding on to him, but she thought maybe she was ready to let the watch run again. It ticked quietly in the dark room. She closed her eyes. Outside, the mountain held them all. The house, the barn, Billy sleeping in his room off the south wall, Gideon in the room above hers. The pines stood in their rows like they'd been standing for centuries and would stand for centuries more. The wind came and tested things and found them solid. What Eliza didn't know yet, what neither of them knew, lying awake on the same night in separate rooms with the watch ticking between them like a small kept promise, was that the hardest test was still coming. That the mountain had been patient with them so far, had let them find their footing, had given them these weeks of cold difficulty and small understandings. It was finished being patient. The storm announced itself 3 days before it arrived. Eliza had been on this mountain long enough by then, 6 weeks, moving into 7, to read the signs, or at least to recognize that the mountain was speaking in a register she was still learning. The light changed first. It went from the flat gray-white of regular winter to something yellower, sicker, a sky that looked like a bruise healing in the wrong direction. Then the animals. The cows pressed to the back of their stalls. The horses went quiet in a way that was different from their usual quiet, heavier, like they were conserving something. Even the birds disappeared from the pines around the homestead 2 full days before the first clouds rolled in over the upper peaks. Billy noticed it first, the way he noticed most things about the mountain, not with analysis, but with a kind of wordless physical awareness, the same way he knew when a horse was about to throw a shoe before it happened. "Bad one coming," he said at breakfast on the Wednesday. He said it the way you'd say, looks like rain if you lived somewhere where rain was an inconvenience rather than a potential death sentence. Gideon was already thinking the same thing. She could see it in the way he'd been recalculating things quietly since Monday, checking the woodpile twice, going back through the supply ledger with a focus that was more deliberate than his usual deliberate. He added 2 days' worth of split wood to the covered stack on the porch. He brought extra lamp oil up from the lower cache. He checked the barn roof for weak points and reinforced 2 of the crossbeams that had been adequate but not excellent. "How bad?" Eliza asked, standing at the window watching the sky do that wrong-colored thing. "Can't know until it hits," Gideon said behind her. "But the way it's building—" He stopped, which was becoming, she'd learned, its own kind of sentence. We make sure everything is done before Thursday night. Everything was done by Thursday afternoon. The timber camp was the problem. There was a stand of timber on the northeast face that Gideon had been contracted to clear for a rail company operating out of Carver's Junction. Good income, reliable work that supplemented the silver operation during the months when the claim yielded slower. He had 2 men up there, Holt and Prentice, both experienced, both paid through the end of the month, both expecting Gideon to come up Thursday to review the week's progress and bring their supplies. "Send Billy," Eliza said. "Billy can't assess the timber work. Holt will cut corners if nobody with authority checks it. Then send a message. Tell them to shelter until the storm passes." By the time a message gets there, Gideon shook his head. "They're expecting me. They'll be out in the field. I go, I assess, I tell them to batten down, and I'm back before it hits." She looked at him. "You said the storm hits Thursday night." "I'll be back by dark." "You said that about the cave-in week 3. You were 2 hours late." Something passed across his face. Not defensiveness, but the flicker of a man who recognizes a valid point and doesn't like it. That was different. Gideon. She said his name the way she'd learned to say it when she wanted him to actually hear her rather than process what she was saying at his usual remove. What is the storm does what it looks like it might do, and you're not back before dark, and you're on the northeast face in the timber? "I know the northeast face. You know it in normal conditions." He looked at her steadily. She looked back. This was something they'd developed over 6 weeks without either of them naming it, a particular register of disagreement that wasn't quite argument, that had room in it for both of them to say what they meant without it becoming something else. "I'll take the quick route up and the eastern trail down," he said. 3 hours up, 2 hours there, 2 hours back. I'll be down before the sky goes ugly." "That's a tight window." "I know it's a tight window." A pause. "I'll be back before dark, Eliza." She believed him. That was the thing. She believed he meant it. She'd learned enough about Gideon Cross in 6 weeks to know that he was not a man who said things carelessly or made promises he expected to break. He calculated risks with precision, lived inside those calculations. This was not recklessness. It was a man trying to balance obligations and doing the arithmetic and reaching a conclusion she didn't entirely agree with but could not definitively refute. He left at first light Thursday. She watched him go up the trail until the pines took him. She turned around and went inside and did not stand at the window again until noon. The morning was functional. She finished winterizing the barn against the coming storm. Extra straw bedding, the water troughs checked, the hay rack refilled. Billy worked alongside her, and they talked about practical things in the way they'd developed over weeks, steady, comfortable, with room for silence. By noon, every animal under that roof was as prepared as it was possible to be. The sky by noon was the color of old pewter. "How long?" she asked Billy, both of them standing in the barn doorway looking at it. Billy pulled his hat down tighter. 4 hours. Maybe 5. He paused. Could be 3. She looked up the trail. "He knows," Billy said, which was the most useful and least comforting thing he could have said. By 2 in the afternoon, she stopped pretending the supply inventory needed reorganizing and stood at the main window watching the tree line. The sky had gone from pewter to something darker, an active, churning dark that moved with intention. The pines were bending. Not far, not dramatically, but bending in a way they hadn't been bending this morning, showing the pale undersides of their needles the way trees do when the wind comes from a new direction. Billy came in at 3, looked at her, looked at the window, and sat down at the table without being asked. At 4, the snow started. Not gently. There was no introductory period, no light flurry leading up to the main event. 1 minute the sky was doing its ugly preparatory work, and the next minute the snow was simply there, horizontal, driven by a wind that hit the house like something with intent. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes. She felt it through the walls. Gideon had said back before dark. It was 4 in the afternoon and she could not see the tree line. "He's not going to make it before this hits," she said. Not to Billy specifically, just out loud, because keeping it inside wasn't helping anything. "He might have sheltered at the timber camp," Billy said, "if he saw it coming fast enough. He'd stay put rather than try to move in this." "Would he?" Billy was quiet for a moment. "He should." That was not the same as yes. He would. She got the fire built up higher and the stove going and checked that the medical kit was where it lived. Top shelf, right side. The book of medicine beside it with the dog-eared pages and Gideon's penciled marginal notes. She told herself this was sensible preparation, not panic. She kept the fire going and the lamp lit in the window. She made food that could stay warm for hours. She sat with Billy at the table and they played cards badly, and neither of them mentioned the window or the sound the wind was making, which had passed from loud into something that didn't have a good word for it. A continuous roar, the kind that had weight. Dark came at 5:30. At 6, Gideon had not come back. At 7, Billy started building up the second fireplace in the corner of the main room without being asked. And Eliza thought, he's not doing that because he's cold. At 8 o'clock, when the wind hit a pitch that made the whole house shudder and the snow on the windows was so thick it had turned the glass opaque, she heard something at the door. Not a knock. She wouldn't have heard a knock in that wind. It was a weight against the door, a body against the door. And then the latch working from outside. The particular sound of someone's hands having trouble with a familiar mechanism. She was at the door before Billy had gotten out of his chair. She pulled it open. Gideon fell through it. Not entirely. He caught the door frame with one hand and kept himself upright, barely, but it was close. He was covered in snow from hat to boot, the kind of coverage that meant time in the open with no shelter and no moving, and his face above the scarf was wrong. Even in the low lamp light, she could see it was wrong. Too pale in some places, too dark in others, and there was something in the way he was holding his left side, a subtle wrongness of posture, a protective hunch. Gideon, shut the door, he said. His voice was steady but compressed, like a man keeping something in. It's bad out there. She got his arm over her shoulder. He let her. That alone told her something was seriously wrong, because Gideon Cross did not lean on people. Billy got the other side, and together they got him to the chair nearest the fire, and he sat heavily, which he never did. And when Eliza started pulling his coat off, he went rigid for a second and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Left side, he said tightly. She pulled the coat open. Even with him still half frozen and in a second layer of wool shirt, she could see the shape was wrong under his ribs. She'd seen enough injured men in a mining town to know what wrong shape under ribs meant. What happened? She said. Timberfall. Short, economical, still managing himself hard. Holt had a chain snap on a cut log. It came sideways. He exhaled. Hit the ground and rolled before it got me full. Just the edge of it. Just the edge, Billy repeated from behind her, with 17-year-old horror he was doing a poor job of hiding. How far did you walk in this? She asked. 4 miles. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and for a moment she let herself simply feel the terror of that. 4 miles at night in a blizzard, with cracked or broken ribs and whatever else the log had done to him. And then she put the terror somewhere she could get to later and focused on what was in front of her. Billy, she said, standing up, get the kettle boiling. Hot water, a lot of it, and bring down every lamp in the house. What do you need the lamps for? Billy asked, already moving. Light? She was already at the top shelf pulling down the medical kit. I need to see what I'm doing. She'd read the medical reference book. That was the thing she kept returning to during the next several minutes as she spread its contents on the cleared kitchen table. I have read this book. Not as a doctor reads it, not as someone trained, but as someone who had found dog-eared pages in a stranger's house and understood, on some level, why those particular pages were marked. Broken ribs, wounds, fever management. She'd read them the way you read something when you're not sure you'll ever need it, but you learn it anyway because the alternative is being caught completely without. She was still going to have to do things she wasn't certain about. She was going to do them anyway. I need to look at the wound properly, she told Gideon. I need you to take off the shirt. It's not that bad, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. Eliza. Gideon. She kept her voice even. I need to look at it. If it's not that bad, then me looking at it won't change anything. So take off the shirt. A beat. 2. He reached up and started working the buttons with hands that were still clumsy from cold, and she helped without being asked, and when the shirt came open, she kept her expression carefully neutral about what she saw. The bruising was spectacular and terrible. A deep purple red that spread from his lower left ribs down across his flank, the kind of bruising that meant something had hit hard, and the body was staging its full protest. There was a laceration along the ribs themselves, not deep but long, bleeding sluggishly. And the way he'd compensated for it with every breath, the shallow way he was breathing, she'd read about that too. Broken ribs changed your breathing, made you guard against the pain. And shallow breathing in a man who'd been in a blizzard was how you got lung fever on top of everything else. "All right," she said quietly, mostly to herself. Then she said to Billy, who'd come in with the kettle, "Set that down and come here. I'm going to need you to hold the light steady and hand me things when I ask." "I can do that," Billy said, setting the kettle down with exaggerated care. "Can you sew a straight line?" Billy's face did something complicated. "I've sewn harness leather. Good enough." She met his eyes. "I'm going to clean the wound, and you're going to help me close it. If you think you're going to be sick, tell me before you are, not during." "I'm not going to be sick," Billy said, with the conviction of someone who was genuinely uncertain but unwilling to admit it. She pulled her chair up close to Gideon and looked at him directly. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I'm sorry." "I know." He held her gaze. "Do what you need to do." She cleaned the wound first. Boiled water, clean cloth, working along the laceration with a methodical care that she had to impose consciously over the part of her brain that kept noting things like, "This is a man, not a problem, and his breathing is too shallow, and what if I do this wrong?" She cleaned it thoroughly because the one thing she knew with certainty from that medical book was that infection on a mountain in February with no doctor within 12 miles was a death sentence written in slow motion. She cleaned it until it bled clean, and then she blotted it and looked at it under the lamp Billy held with both hands, and a concentration so intense his ears had gone red. The stitching took 40 minutes. She had done exactly one piece of stitching in her life before this, which was sewing a wound on a farm horse's leg when she was 14 and her father was 3 miles away and the horse was bleeding. She had done it adequately. The horse had survived. She held on to that. Gideon made almost no sound. He was gripping the arm of the chair with his right hand in a way that went past white-knuckled into something else, and twice she felt the muscles in his torso go rigid in ways she knew were costing him significantly, and once, only once, she heard something come out of him that was almost a word but wasn't, a controlled release of pain that he'd compressed until it was nearly nothing, and that nearly was the part that went into her chest and stayed there. "Almost," she told him. "You're doing fine." "I'm aware," he said through his teeth, and somehow that was almost funny, and she bit the inside of her cheek and kept going. When it was done, she sat back and her hands were shaking. She noticed that with something like detachment. She put the needle and thread down carefully on the cloth and pressed both palms flat on her thighs until the shaking stopped, which took about 15 seconds. She bandaged the wound tight enough to support the ribs, which she could not set and could only support. The book had been clear about that. She bound it with the clean linen strips from the kit and the last of her cotton petticoat that she'd cut up without hesitating about it. While she worked, she talked, partly to keep him focused, and partly because she needed something to do with the part of herself that was still terrified. "Holt and Prentice," she said. "Where are they?" "Timber camp structure," Gideon said. His voice was better now, steadier, the worst of the immediate pain managed. "It's solid. They have supplies for a week. They know to stay put. I told them before I left." A breath, careful. "The chain snap was already fixed by then. The injury happened right before I was heading out. I didn't want to stay there, get caught in the camp when the storm hit full. So you walked 4 miles in a blizzard with broken ribs rather than stay in a solid shelter." A pause. "When you say it like that, how would you like me to say it?" He made that sound again, the almost something that lived in the same neighborhood as a laugh, but was too tired to complete the journey. "Fair," he said. She made him drink the broth she'd kept warm. He drank it because arguing would have required energy he didn't have. She kept the fire at a roar because the shallow breathing was still worrying her, and cold air on top of everything else was not something she was willing to add to the situation. Billy fell asleep in his chair at some point after midnight, still sitting upright, and she left him there. The storm outside was not a thing you could describe usefully. It was simply enormous and loud and absolute, and it had been those things for hours, and it showed no sign of becoming anything else. The house took it. The house had always been built like it expected exactly this. She sat in the chair across from Gideon, close enough to the fire that she could see his face clearly. His eyes were closed. His breathing was still too shallow for her to entirely relax about. But it was regular. It was steady. The color in his face had come back from the edge of frightening. Sometime in the second hour of her watch, after Billy was asleep and the wind was doing its worst, and the fire was the only color in the world, Gideon opened his eyes and found her looking at him. "You should sleep," he said. "You should stop telling me to sleep at inconvenient moments." A pause. "You've been watching me breathe." "You were breathing wrong. I'm breathing better." "I know, I'm still watching." He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. Outside, the storm hit something, and the whole house took the impact like a ship taking a wave. "Eliza." His voice was different, not the compressed, managing pain voice of the last several hours. Something quieter. "Why did you come out in this tonight?" She looked at him. "The door. You heard me at the door through that wind." "I was already at the window." He absorbed this. She watched something move through his face, the particular movement of a man encountering something he hadn't expected and not being sure yet what to do with it. "You stayed up," he said. "Of course I stayed up. I told you. If I wasn't back, you told me not to come looking," she said. "You told me to stay here and keep the fire and wait. That's what I did. I stayed and I kept the fire and I waited. I was waiting at the window, which is why I heard you at the door." She met his eyes steadily. "I didn't go out into the blizzard. I just didn't go to sleep." He held her gaze for a long moment. The fire cracked loudly, and a log shifted and sparks rose and fell. "The stitching," he said finally, "was better than it had any right to be. I practiced on a horse when I was 14. Is that—" He stopped, seemed genuinely uncertain whether that was a joke. "Partly," she said. Something happened in his face then. Not the almost laugh from before, but something more complete. Brief, quickly controlled, but real. It changed the landscape of him for a moment, showed her something underneath the habitual stillness. She didn't make a thing of it. "The book," she said instead. "Your medical book, the dog-eared pages. You marked the section on rib injuries." A beat. "I've been alone up here a long time." "I know." "A man thinks about what happens if—" He stopped, tried again. "I wanted to know what to do if something happened, even if there was nobody to do it, even if the knowing didn't change the outcome." He looked at the fire. "It's different, knowing, from not knowing, even when the result is the same." She understood that completely. She understood it in a way that had nothing to do with ribs or medicine or mountain winters. She understood it as a statement about being the kind of person who would rather know the worst fully than be surprised by it. She had been that person her entire life. Her mother had called it a hard way to live and had meant it with love. "Sleep," she told him, before either of them had to figure out what to do with how much that had meant. "I'll keep watch until the storm breaks." He didn't argue. She thought he might have wanted to, on principle, but the injury and the cold and the 4 miles in the blizzard had cleaned most of the argument out of him. "Wake me at 3, he said. "I can watch the second half." "I'll consider it." "Eliza." "Sleep, Gideon." His eyes closed. She stayed in her chair by the fire, close enough to see his chest rise and fall in the too shallow but steady rhythm that she was going to keep watching until it wasn't too shallow anymore. Billy snored softly in his chair. The house shuddered once, twice, found its ground again. Outside, the storm did everything it had promised. Inside, the fire held, and the lamps held, and the woman who'd arrived 6 weeks ago with $4.11 and a hole in her elbow sat through the worst night the mountain had produced all winter, watching the man she'd married breathe and didn't sleep and didn't leave and wasn't afraid. That was the thing she noted in the long, quiet hours before dawn, in the same flat, factual way she noted most things about herself. She'd been afraid of the mountain those first weeks, afraid of the dark and the cold and the silence and all the ways a person could disappear up here and never be found. She'd been afraid of Gideon at the beginning, a different kind of fear than she'd admitted to herself. Not violence fear, but unknown fear, the fear of being bound to someone you don't understand. She was not afraid now. She was tired, and her hand still carried the faint tremor of hours of concentrated work. And she was going to be deeply sore in the morning from sitting in this chair, and she had no idea what came next. For the storm, for the claim, for the two of them, for any of it. But she was not afraid. The mountain had tested her tonight. She thought, sitting in the firelight with the storm screaming outside and Gideon Cross breathing steady in the chair across from her, that she might have passed. The storm broke sometime before dawn, the way bad things sometimes end. Not with drama, but with a quiet exhaustion. The wind dropping off in stages until the house stopped shuddering and the snow came straight down instead of sideways and then stopped altogether. Eliza noticed the change from her chair by the fire, noticed it the way you notice when a sound you've stopped hearing as sound finally goes silent. The absence of it was almost loud. She sat in that new quiet for a while. The fire had burned down to deep coals that threw a red light across the room. Billy was still in his chair, head dropped to one shoulder, mouth slightly open, making the small snoring sounds of someone in genuine deep sleep. Gideon was still in his chair too, and his breathing was different than it had been at midnight, deeper, less guarded, the pain having receded enough in sleep that his body was finally taking the breaths it needed. She watched the coals for a while. Then she got up very quietly, added 2 logs to the fire, and went upstairs and slept for 4 hours. She woke to the sound of Billy making noise in the kitchen below, the particular clatter of a 17-year-old who had never quite mastered the art of moving through a space without announcing himself, and lay for a moment with the ceiling above her and the events of the night assembling themselves in order in her mind. She got up. She went downstairs. Gideon was awake. He was still in the chair because getting up would have required a negotiation with his ribs that he apparently hadn't attempted yet, but he was upright and alert and drinking coffee that Billy had put in his hand, and when Eliza came down the stairs, he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She couldn't classify it immediately. It was not gratitude, exactly. Or not only gratitude. It was something more unsettled than that. The look of a man who'd spent the night with the evidence of something he was still working out how to account for. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. Billy looked between them with the studied nonchalance of someone deeply interested in what was happening and pretending otherwise. "There's coffee," he said helpfully. "I can see that." She poured herself a cup and sat down across from Gideon, which was the same position she'd held all night, and somehow felt different in daylight. They drank coffee. Billy made eggs. Outside, the world was blanketed in a new 3 feet of snow that turned the light coming through the windows into something almost blue. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like a log rolled over me," Gideon said. "That's accurate." "The ribs." He shifted, and she watched him absorb the movement with the careful management of someone who had mapped out exactly where his pain was. "The stitching held. I checked it when you were asleep. It's clean." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "You need to stay in the chair today. Not the claim, not the barn, nothing that requires Eliza. I'm telling you what the book says, not what I think you want to hear." A beat. He looked at his coffee. "What does the book say? Broken ribs heal in 6 weeks if you don't aggravate them. If you do, it's longer. If you push them hard before the bone knits and something shifts into the lung." She stopped. She'd read that section twice during the night. 6 weeks, Gideon. That's all I'm asking. Be sensible for 6 weeks. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire talked. Billy set a plate of eggs in front of each of them with the exaggerated care of someone trying not to make any noise, while 2 other people were having a conversation. 6 weeks, Gideon said finally. Not agreeing, exactly. Processing. "Billy and Holt can manage the claim work. You can direct from here." "Holt doesn't..." "Then write him a letter. Telegraph him from Carver's Junction when the trail clears. Tell him exactly what needs doing." She kept her voice even. "You are no use to this claim dead, Gideon, or with a bone fragment in your lung." He looked at her then, directly, the way he didn't always do, the way she'd learned to recognize as him actually letting himself look at something rather than assessing it. "All right," he said. "All right what? 6 weeks." He picked up his fork. "I'll be sensible." She didn't push it further. She ate her eggs, which Billy had made adequately, if not skillfully, and she looked out the window at the new snow and the blue-white light and the enormity of everything that had happened in the last 12 hours, and she thought, one day at a time, same as it's always been. The recovery was not smooth. She hadn't expected it to be because nothing on this mountain was smooth, and Gideon Cross confined to the house was a different kind of problem than Gideon Cross moving around the homestead with his usual purposeful efficiency. He was not a complainer. She'd give him that without reservation. He absorbed the ongoing discomfort of broken ribs with a stoicism that was almost impressive and occasionally maddening because it made it harder to gauge how he was actually doing. But being forced into stillness when his nature ran entirely contrary to stillness produced a low-grade tension in him that expressed itself in ways she was learning to read. He directed. Constantly. Billy bore most of this with the easy patience of someone who'd been dealing with Gideon's directions for 2 years. But even Billy came in from the barn one afternoon and said, in a tone of quiet desperation, "He needs something to do with his hands." She solved this by finding a secondary ledger at the back of the supply shelf. A year-old one, full of loose calculations and reference notes that had never been properly organized, and presenting it to Gideon with the suggestion that having accurate historical records of yield patterns might be useful for projecting the spring season. She didn't say, "Here is something to keep you occupied." She said, "I think this would help with the spring projections," and set it on the table beside him and walked away. He was still at it when she came back to make dinner, and the day after that. By the end of the first week of his recovery, she had learned more about the Silver Cross claim, which was what she'd started calling it, after noticing that the original claim paperwork she'd found in the supply chest was registered under that name, than she'd thought to ask in 2 months. Not because Gideon had suddenly become a different kind of person, more open and forthcoming, but because being in the same room with someone for extended periods when that someone is reviewing historical data creates a natural current of conversation, and Gideon, it turned out, became considerably more talkative when the subject was his silver. "There's a second vein," he told her one evening, running a finger along a column in the ledger. "Parallel to the main one, about 30 feet east. I've been watching the ground patterns for a year, the yield composition in the last quarter." He stopped and looked up, apparently checking whether she was actually listening or being polite. She had pulled her chair over to see the ledger. "Show me," she said. He showed her. She understood perhaps 60% of what he explained. She asked questions about the other 40, and he answered them without impatience. And then she asked more questions because she actually wanted to know. And somewhere in the second hour of this, she realized that Gideon Cross talking about his mountain was the most fully present she had ever seen him. The remove dropped away. The careful distance collapsed. He was simply a man who loved the thing he'd built and hadn't had anyone to share it with, and the talking poured out of him the way water runs when you clear the obstruction. She thought about what Billy had said. Internal. Most of his talking happened somewhere you can't hear it. She could hear it now. She found, sitting at that table with the lamplight on the ledger pages, and Gideon's voice low and precise and alive with something she hadn't seen in him before, that the thing she'd told herself she needed, patience, had apparently been doing its work without her noticing. But the talking was only one side of it. The other side came slower and less predictably, in the way real things usually did. It started with Thomas. She hadn't planned to talk about Thomas. She'd made a private arrangement with herself back in the first weeks that her grief was hers to carry and not something she was going to present to a man she barely knew who had enough of his own burdens. She'd honored that arrangement carefully. But in the second week of Gideon's recovery, when the snow outside was still deep and the days were long and quiet, and they were spending more time in the same room than they ever had before, something shifted in that arrangement. She had the pocket watch out on the table. She'd been winding it, which she'd made a habit since that first night, and Gideon saw it. He looked at it for a moment, then, "Is that my husband's?" she said. She said it without thinking, and then corrected herself with a strange little lurch. "My first husband's." Gideon was quiet. "Thomas?" she said. "His name was Thomas Hart." She turned the watch over in her palm. "He died in a tunnel collapse 6 weeks before you found me in that street." "I'm sorry," Gideon said. He said it plainly, without the elaborate sympathy people sometimes layered onto condolences to make themselves feel more adequate to the moment. Just, "I'm sorry," simple and meant. "He was a good man," she said, "not always a practical one. He believed things were going to work out more often than they did, which was sometimes wonderful and sometimes—" She stopped. "He laughed easily. I miss that the most, I think. The way he laughed before he decided whether something was funny." Gideon was watching her, not with pity, with that careful attention he gave things when he was genuinely trying to understand them. "You kept the watch," he said. "I couldn't leave it." She set it on the table. "I've been thinking I should put it away. Not forget it. I don't want to forget it. Just, she looked for the word. Stop carrying it in my hand and start carrying it somewhere else. There's no schedule for that, Gideon said. She looked at him. People tell you there's a schedule, he said, as if he was talking about something he'd thought about before from his own angle. A proper way to do it. A time when it's supposed to be done. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. I don't think there is. She waited. She'd learned that Gideon Cross, when he was approaching something from his own territory, needed the silence left open. My brother, he said. Daniel. He died 8 years ago. Fever. He was looking at the table. I came up here the year after. Everybody thought I came for the silver. A pause. The silver was why I stayed. She understood this completely and immediately. The way a place could become the repository for all the things you couldn't carry anywhere else. The way distance from people could feel, for a while, like relief. 8 years, she said. It gets different, not smaller, different. He looked up. You start to find places to put it that aren't in your hands all the time. She looked at the watch on the table between them. Then she picked it up and held it for a moment and then set it down and left it there. Didn't put it in her pocket, didn't take it back upstairs. Just left it on the table, where she could see it, where it wasn't hidden, where it was just a thing that had belonged to someone she loved and still did and always would. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded and went back to his ledger. It wasn't a scene. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was two people sitting at a kitchen table talking about the dead they carried, which was ordinary and not ordinary at all, which was the most human conversation she'd had in the better part of a year. She was still thinking about it 2 days later when she caught herself watching him cross the kitchen and noticed, with something between exasperation and honesty, that somewhere in the last several weeks she had stopped seeing Gideon Cross as a problem to be solved. She wasn't entirely sure what she was seeing him as instead. She kept that observation to herself for a while. The second week of recovery was better than the first. His color had come fully back, and the shallow breathing had deepened into something more normal. And while the ribs still had weeks of healing ahead of them, he'd stopped moving like every step required individual negotiation. He sat with her in the evenings and went through the ledger system she'd rebuilt and added notes of his own in the margins, in that clean, precise hand, and occasionally one of his notes would intersect with something she'd organized, and he'd say, "This is good," or "This works in the flat, factual way." He acknowledged things, and she'd found herself, embarrassingly, looking forward to that. It was Billy who said it out loud, because Billy was 17 and had not yet developed the social instinct that told you when a thing was better left in the air. He said it to Eliza specifically, on a Tuesday afternoon when Gideon was in the barn directing Holt through a repair he wasn't supposed to be helping with physically, and Eliza had come in from checking the lower woodpile to find Billy sitting at the table eating cold biscuits, with the look of someone who'd been thinking hard about something. "Can I say something?" Billy said, "without you being weird about it?" "Probably not," Eliza said, "but say it anyway. You two are different now," he said, "than when you first got here." He watched her carefully. "I don't mean bad different. I mean, before, it was like you were two people being very careful about taking up the right amount of space. Now you're just," he gestured vaguely, "in the same room." She considered several responses. "That's fairly observant," she said finally. "I'm not just good with horses," Billy said with dignity. She smiled at that, a real one, the kind that arrived without being summoned. And Billy looked briefly delighted, the way he did when the world confirmed one of his better opinions of itself. "He talks more," Billy said, quieter now. "Since you've been here. I don't mean just lately, since the injury. I mean generally. He asks things. I don't know, he pays attention different." A pause. "He was fine before. He wasn't miserable or anything. He just was very self-contained, like a house with all the shutters closed. You can see there's light inside, but you can't really—" Billy stopped, appeared to feel he'd extended the metaphor past its useful limit. "Anyway, it's good. That's all I was saying." She thought about that later that night, sitting with the fire going low and Gideon across from her, both of them with books open that neither of them was entirely reading. A house with all the shutters closed. She thought about the shutters and what it meant that she could see the light now, that the shutters had not opened all the way, but had let in enough that the rooms inside were starting to be visible. She thought, when did I stop being afraid of what I'd find in there? She thought, I think when I found out it was a person. Just a person. Damaged in some of the same places I'm damaged. Careful in some of the same ways. Learning the same lesson I'm learning, which is that being alone for long enough starts to feel like a choice and then starts to feel like a sentence. Gideon, she said. He looked up from his book. She'd been going to say something practical. She'd had something practical prepared. Instead, she said, Are you glad I'm here? The fire made its sound. The question sat in the air between them. She watched him process it, watched the careful, deliberate way he turned the question over, the way he didn't give automatic answers, which was something she respected about him even when it made things harder. Yes, he said. No elaboration. No softening. Just the word, flat and final and entirely real. I'm glad I'm here too, she said. I didn't expect to be. I thought, when I said yes to you in that street, I thought I was just buying time, surviving until something else came along. She looked at her hands. But there isn't somewhere else I'm supposed to be. I didn't know that then. She looked up at him. I know it now. He held her gaze for a long moment. The light from the fire moved across his face, and she could see all the things in there that he didn't say readily. The long years of the mountain, the solitude that had become structural, the effort it was taking him to hold a door open that he'd kept shut for a very long time. I want to tell you something, he said. She waited. The night I found you, he said, in Blackridge. It wasn't a random thing, me being in town. I'd been putting off the supply run for 3 weeks. I kept making reasons not to go down. He looked at the fire. The mountain is easier than people. It always has been for me. I know what it wants. I know how to read it. He was quiet for a moment. Billy had been after me for a month about going, said I was getting strange. He didn't say that, but he meant it. A brief, almost expression. I finally went down. I was there one night. I was going to do the supply run and go back and not look at anybody, not talk to anybody, just get what I needed and come back up to where I knew what I was doing. She was very still. I saw Dodd throw you out, he said. I'd already finished my business. The wagon was loaded. I was leaving. He stopped. I watched you get up out of the snow, and I couldn't... He looked for the word, and she could see the effort of it, the genuine labor of making language do what he needed it to do. I couldn't walk away from that. I tried to decide whether I should, and I couldn't, so I didn't. The fire cracked. That's why, he said. If you ever wondered. She had wondered. She'd told herself various versions of the story, convenience, practicality, a man's calculation about what the mountain needed. All of those things had probably been true, but they had not been the whole truth, and she'd suspected that. And here was the whole truth sitting across from her in a chair, in a man who had trouble with people and had walked toward one anyway. She thought about Thomas, and his easy laugh, and the way love had been simple with him, arrived young and uncomplicated, before either of them had enough damage to make things hard. She thought about what it meant to come to something after damage, to come to it with full knowledge of what it cost, to choose it not because it was easy, but because you had looked at the alternative and found it unacceptable. I'm glad you couldn't walk away, she said. He nodded once. And for what it's worth, she said, I also couldn't walk away from you. I mean that I've had chances, small ones, to write to someone in Ohio, to go down to Carver's Junction and figure something else out. I thought about it in the first weeks. She was being honest because this was a conversation for honesty. But it always felt like leaving something I hadn't finished yet. And then it stopped feeling like that. And then it started feeling like this was just, she searched, where I live, what I'm doing, what matters. She shook her head slightly. I stopped thinking of it as a temporary arrangement. I don't know exactly when. Gideon Cross looked at his wife across the firelight with an expression that was still reserved, still careful, still the expression of a man who had spent too long alone on a mountain to simply and easily put his whole self on display. But the shutters were open, the rooms were visible, and the light inside was real. He didn't reach across the space between them. She didn't either. They were both people who moved at the pace of things they were certain of, and this was not the moment for gestures, which could be misread and would feel cheap against the weight of what had just passed between them. But he held her gaze and did not look away, and she held his and didn't either. And the fire went on burning in the hearth of the house that was holding both of them against the mountain and the dark. Outside, something had changed in the weather. She noticed it distantly. The air had a different quality, the cold a slightly different character. The deep heart of winter had not broken, would not break for weeks, but something in it had shifted. A small thing, the kind you only noticed because you'd been paying very close attention. 3 weeks later, Gideon was back at the claim, not at full strength. The ribs still gave him trouble at the end of a long day, and he came in some evenings with his jaw set and his posture carrying something he wasn't saying, and she kept the willow bark tea made and set it in front of him without making it a conversation. And he drank it without making it a conversation, which was one of the better things about how they operated together. But he was back in his element, reading the ground, directing Holt and Prentice with the precision of someone who had spent 4 years learning a very specific piece of mountain, and the distance between them when he came in at night was not the distance of before. It was something new. The kind of space that exists not because two people are staying apart, but because two people are each complete enough to not need to be constantly in contact. A comfortable distance, the kind you choose rather than maintain. Billy noticed this too, because Billy noticed everything. "Told you," he said one afternoon without context, nodding at nothing in particular. "You did," Eliza agreed. He looked extremely pleased with himself. What she hadn't told Billy. What she hadn't fully told herself yet, though it was assembling in the back of her mind with the patience of something that understood it would be acknowledged eventually, was that she was building something here that she hadn't set out to build and didn't have a clean name for yet. Not just a household, not just a function. Something with more weight than that and more future. She stood at the window one evening in early March, the last of the winter light going blue and then gray over the mountains, and she looked out at the trail coming down from the claim and watched for the figure she'd been watching for every evening for weeks now. And when he came around the bend in the trees, she felt something in her chest that was clear and steady and entirely unlike anything she'd felt since before Thomas died. She thought, oh. She thought, well. She went to put dinner on the stove. Spring came to the mountain the way it always did up there. Not as an arrival, but as a slow argument, winter refusing to concede anything cleanly, giving up ground in inches. March was still hard. April was better in theory than in practice. But by the first week of May, something had genuinely shifted in the light, the way it hit the upper slopes in the late afternoon, and turned the snowmelt into something that looked almost like gold running between the rocks. And the pines had that new growth smell that was so specific and alive, it hit you in the chest when the wind brought it through the window. Eliza noticed all of it. She'd become a person who noticed the mountain now, which had happened so gradually she couldn't point to the moment it started. She'd arrived in winter darkness, survived it, worked through it, and come out the other side with a relationship to this specific piece of ground that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't done the same thing. The mountain had not become gentle, it had simply become hers. She was in the supply chest pulling the quarterly records when she found the letter. It had come up with the last post run, tucked among the hardware invoices and a seed catalog she'd ordered from Denver, and it sat in her hand with the weight of something trying to look ordinary. The return address was a legal firm in Denver, Hargrove, Sills and Crane, attorneys at law. The letter was addressed to Gideon Cross. She set it on the table and went to find him. He was at the claim. She walked up the trail herself, which she did routinely now without the careful anxiety of the early weeks, and found him at the mouth of the secondary shaft talking to Holt about the timbering supports. He saw her face and cut the conversation short. She handed him the letter on the walk back down. He read it twice, which she knew meant it was bad. He read things once when they were routine. Twice meant he was making sure he'd understood correctly before he reacted. "Consolidated Mountain Resources," he said. "I don't know them. You wouldn't. They're new." He folded the letter with a crispness that meant he was controlling something. They've been buying up claims across 3 counties. Small operations mostly. They send a letter first, make an offer. If you don't sell... He stopped walking. They were at the porch now. He looked at the letter again, then at the mountain above them, the pines, the claim trail, the 4 years of work visible in the infrastructure of the place if you knew what you were looking at. They're challenging the original claim registration, saying the survey markers were improperly filed in 1880. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Were they? she said. No. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had checked. I did the survey myself. I had it witnessed and filed in Carver's Junction and copied to the county seat. He looked at her. But filing a challenge costs them nothing. Fighting a challenge costs me time and money, and if they drag it out long enough, you run out of one or both, she said. That's the idea. She took the letter back from him and read it herself, standing on the porch in the May light. The language was what legal language always was. Precise and bloated at the same time, saying simple things in the most complicated possible way, but the simple thing it was saying was, we want your mountain and we have lawyers and we're willing to wait. She had a thought. She didn't say it yet. She turned it over and examined it from several angles. Where are your original filings? She said. Supply chest, locked section, bottom. I want to look at them tonight. He looked at her. Eliza, I've already looked at them. Everything is in order. I know, she said. I still want to look. He recognized the expression she was wearing, had learned to recognize it over the months, the particular focused stillness she got when her mind had found a thread worth pulling, and he stood aside and let her past. She spread the original claim documents across the kitchen table that evening. Survey maps, witness statements, the original registration paperwork, the quarterly yield report she'd been meticulously maintaining since February, the historical ledger she'd reorganized during Gideon's recovery. She went through all of it with the same methodical attention she'd learned from her mother balancing farm accounts, not looking for anything specific at first, just reading the whole picture. Billy sat at the end of the table, not being asked to leave, which meant he was allowed to stay, watching her work with an expression of deep concentration, as if proximity to the process might transfer understanding. Gideon sat across from her. He'd brought coffee. He didn't interfere. Here, she said, after 2 hours. She turned the original survey map toward him and put her finger on a notation in the lower corner, a reference number cross-filed to the county records that would, if followed, produce the original witness documentation for the survey markers. Consolidated's challenge is based on claiming the markers weren't witnessed correctly, she said, but this reference number points to the original witness filing. If that filing is still in the county records, it should be, then their whole challenge falls apart before it starts. She sat back. But we need the physical document. The reference number alone isn't enough. We need to produce the actual filing. A good lawyer can get it pulled from the county seat records and entered as evidence before they can claim it doesn't exist. Gideon looked at the map, looked at the reference number, looked at her. You found that in 2 hours, he said. I've been organizing these records for months. I know where everything is. She held his gaze. We need a lawyer, Gideon, a real one, not Pickman, someone who practices actual litigation. There's a firm in Carver's Junction. Is it good? I don't know. I've never needed a lawyer before. Then we go to Denver, she said. We go to Denver, we find a good one, and we take every document on this table with us. He looked at the table, the spread of papers, years of careful record keeping, the evidence of everything they'd built here assembled in one place. And she could see him calculating, which was what he always did, weighing the cost, the time, the exposure of going down off the mountain into the city, of putting the claim's fate in the hands of another person. I can go alone, she said, if you'd rather stay with the claim. I'm not sending you to Denver alone. I've managed on my own before. That's not... He stopped. Something moved across his face. I'll go with you. We both go. A pause. Billy can manage here for a week with Holt. Billy, who had been pretending not to listen with complete unsuccessfulness, said, I can absolutely manage here. Without burning anything down, Gideon said. The barn fire was one time, and it wasn't really a... Billy. I won't burn anything down, Billy said. They left on a Tuesday, the trail clear enough by May for the wagon, the mountains behind them as they descended toward the valley, and the road that led eventually to the railroad town and then to Denver. Eliza sat beside Gideon on the wagon seat with the leather document case in her lap. Everything organized, indexed, in the order a lawyer would need them, and watched the altitude change, the vegetation shifting from mountain pine to scrub to the wider open grassland of the lower elevations. It felt strange to leave. Stranger than she'd expected. She hadn't left the mountain since January. She hadn't thought about that much until now, sitting on the wagon watching the world open up below them. 6 months. She had lived on that mountain for 6 months, and somewhere in those months it had become the place she thought of when she thought the word home, which was not something she would have predicted in the street in Blackridge with the snow in her hair and $4 in her pocket. She thought about the woman she'd been in that street, 24 years old and out of options, and making a decision so fast there hadn't been room to be properly afraid of it until afterward. She thought about whether that woman would recognize herself now, the one who knew where the willow bark was kept and how to read the bad weather coming in the sky, and exactly which pages of the medical book were worth studying, who had a mountain and a man and a strange, honest, difficult, useful life. She thought the woman in the street might have cried if she could have seen this far ahead. Out of relief, probably. Maybe out of something more complicated. The way you cry when something turns out to mean more than you'd been allowed to hope for. "You're quiet," Gideon said beside her. "I'm thinking." "About Denver?" "About January," she said. "About that street." He didn't say anything for a moment. The horses moved steadily down the grade. A hawk turned slow circles above the valley. "Do you regret it?" he asked. He said it without particular anxiety. A plain question, the way he asked plain questions. "Not for a single day," she said. And that was true in a way very few things were entirely true. Not without complexity, not without grief for Thomas and the life that had ended before this one started, not without the understanding that hard things had happened to bring her here. But underneath all of that, underneath the complexity, not for a single day. He put his hand over hers on the document case. Not a dramatic gesture, brief, firm, then gone, because that was how he was. But there, Denver was loud and large and smelled like coal smoke and horse traffic, and the particular combination of money and desperation that all cities seemed to produce when mining wealth was involved. They stayed 2 nights in a respectable hotel on Larimer Street and spent the days in the offices of a lawyer named Aldous Marsh, who came recommended by the man at the assayer's office, and who turned out to be small, sharp-eyed, somewhere in his late 40s, and deeply unimpressed by Consolidated Mountain Resources. "I've seen 4 of their challenges in the last year," Marsh said, turning over Eliza's organized documents with the professional efficiency of a man who'd spent decades reading legal paperwork. "Same pattern every time. They pick small operators, file a challenge on a technicality, run up costs. Most people settle." He looked up over his glasses. "The ones who don't settle and have their paperwork in order win." "Our paperwork is in order," Eliza said. Marsh looked at the document index she'd prepared. Every record organized by date and category. The key items flagged. The reference number for the county witness filing highlighted at the top. He looked at it for a moment longer than he needed to. "Yes," he said. "It is." He looked at her, then at Gideon. "This is your work?" "My wife organized the records," Gideon said. "Your wife saved your claim," Marsh said, with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who valued precision. "Half the operators I see come in here with a box of loose papers and a hope. This," he set the index down. "This tells the story before I have to find it. It changes what I can do in court significantly." He took the case. He pulled the county witness filing within 3 days. It existed, intact, exactly where the reference number said it was, filed in the spring of 1880 in Eliza's own handwriting, no, in the county clerk's hand. Gideon had done everything correctly 4 years ago, every marker witnessed and documented, every form filed in the right office. Consolidated Mountain Resources' challenge collapsed in the preliminary hearing. It took 6 weeks in total from the date of the letter to the date of the dismissal, and Eliza spent most of those weeks on the mountain while Marsh handled the legal process, waiting for letters and sending responses, keeping the records he needed organized and complete. There was a period in early June, 3 weeks into the process, when Consolidated's lawyers filed a secondary challenge, a different angle, a different technical argument, and she spent 2 days going through every document she had looking for the response. She found it at 2 in the morning on the second day in the original yield records from 1881, a secondary survey notation that had been made after the initial filing, properly witnessed, that directly addressed the new angle of attack. She wrote the response herself, longhand, sitting at the kitchen table with Billy asleep in his chair across the room, and sent it down to Marsh by the Morning Post writer. Marsh sent back 3 words. That finishes it. The dismissal came on a Tuesday in late June. Marsh's letter arrived mid-morning, and Eliza read it standing at the kitchen table and put it down and stood there for a moment with her hand flat on the wood. Gideon came in from the claim at noon. She'd waited to tell him in person. She handed him the letter. He read it. Once, which meant he understood it fully the first time. He set it down. He stood at the table with his back to her for a long moment, and she could see the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man letting something go that he'd been carrying without realizing quite how heavy it was. It's done, he said. It's done. He turned around. He looked at her with an expression that she'd been learning the vocabulary of for 6 months and still found she needed new words for. Gratitude was in there, yes, but under it something larger, something that had to do with the specific weight of having been fought for. You did this, he said. We did this. Eliza. He said her name the way he sometimes said it now, not as address but as something else, as the word that meant several things at once. You have no idea. He stopped, started over. When I built this claim, I thought I was building something for myself, because there was nothing else, because the mountain was the only thing I could manage to care about after, he paused, after Daniel, after a long time alone. He looked at the letter, then at her. I didn't think it could be for 2 people. I'd forgotten what that felt like, building something for 2 people. She crossed the kitchen, and she stood in front of him, and she put her hand on his chest, over the ribs that had healed, and she looked up at him. It's for more than 2 now, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, reading what was in her face, and something in his eyes changed. A careful, still shock, the kind that happens when something you'd privately hoped for announces itself as real. She hadn't been certain yet, not 2 weeks ago. She was certain now. She'd been going to find a quieter moment, a prepared moment. But standing in the kitchen with the dismissal letter on the table and the mountain visible through the window and 6 months of a life she hadn't planned to love behind her, there wasn't any reason to wait for quieter. I'm going to need you to stay off the high trails for a while, she said. After the fall. He put his hands on her shoulders. Eliza, he said. I know it's... She took a breath. I'm not afraid of it. I want you to know that. I'm not afraid of it. He pulled her in and held her carefully, the way he did things, without excess, without performance, with complete attention. She pressed her face against the worn fabric of his shirt and felt the solid reality of him, and let herself stay there. After a while, he said into her hair, The claim is going to need a better structure. She laughed. She didn't mean to, but she did, surprised out of her, the way Thomas's laugh used to arrive. You're thinking about the claim structure right now. I'm thinking about what we're building, he said. I want it to last. She pulled back far enough to see his face. He was not smiling. Gideon Cross did not smile easily or often. But something in his expression was open in a way that took her breath slightly, the way unexpected things did when you'd stopped expecting them. It'll last, she said. She meant the claim. She meant the house. She meant all of it. He nodded once, the way he agreed to things that mattered. By August, the mountain had changed again, the way it was always changing. New people on the trails, word having spread through Carver's Junction and beyond, that the Silver Cross claim was producing well and operating fairly and had beaten back the corporate challenge that had swallowed up 3 other operations in the county. 2 families came up in July, settling the flat ground east of the claim where the timber had been cleared, building small but solid houses with the kind of pragmatic determination that people brought to new places when they understood what the place required. A 3rd family arrived in August. A 4th was expected in September. Billy turned 18 in July, and Gideon gave him a share in the claim operation, formal and legal, documented in Eliza's handwriting in the ledger and in a letter sent to Marsh for proper recording. Billy stood in the kitchen holding the paperwork with the ears too big for his head look he still sometimes got when the world surprised him, and then he folded it very carefully and put it in his shirt pocket close to his chest. You don't have to, he started. You've earned it, Gideon said, that's all. Billy looked at Eliza. She gave him the smallest nod. He swallowed hard and said nothing else, which was the most significant silence she'd ever heard from him. In September, Eliza stood on the front porch of the house that had scared her, first night, with its size and its solidity and its complete indifference to who she'd been before, and looked down the slope toward the small scatter of buildings that had assembled themselves around the claim operation over the summer. Cookfire smoke from two of the new houses, a dog barking somewhere down the trail, the sound of children, which was new and strange and good in the way strange good things were. She had a letter in her hand from a woman in Carver's Junction, the wife of one of the timber contractors who'd heard about the blizzard night and the stitching, and who wanted to know if Eliza had any medical knowledge because the nearest doctor was 12 miles away, and the winter was coming, and several families on the mountain had no one else to ask. She'd been thinking about that letter for 3 days. She heard Gideon's step on the porch behind her. He came and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at. The new houses, the smoke, the evidence of a community assembling itself around the thing they'd built and fought for and held on to. "What's the letter?" he said. "A woman who needs someone with medical knowledge." She paused. "I have a book with dog-eared pages and one successful stitching to my name." "You have more than that." "I know," she said. "I know I do." She folded the letter. "I'm going to write her back. I'm going to say yes." She looked at him sideways. "You're not going to tell me it's too much?" "No," he said. "I'm not." She nodded. The mountain was going gold now with the turn of the season, the aspens catching first, that particular Colorado yellow that looked almost unreal against the dark pines. The sky above the peaks was the deep blue of high altitude and clear weather, the kind of blue that made you understand why people came to these mountains, even knowing what they cost. She thought about something she'd never had adequate words for, the things she'd learned up here that no one had taught her, and that she didn't think you could teach directly. That survival wasn't the end of a story. It was just the beginning of the next one. That the woman who'd gotten up out of the snow in Black Ridge in January hadn't been reborn into someone new. She'd been continuous with that woman, connected to her, was still her in all the ways that mattered, had simply been given the conditions to find out what she was made of. What she was made of had turned out to be more than she'd known. That was the thing worth knowing. Not that the world got kinder, or that luck turned, or that the right person appeared at the right moment. Though all of those things had happened, and she was not ungrateful. But that she had been, in herself, enough. Enough to make the choice, enough to climb the mountain, enough to do the stitching and find the document and fight for what mattered. Enough to let something new grow in the cleared ground left by grief. She was not a different person than the one who'd collapsed in the snow. She was the same person, having found out what she was capable of. That was what the mountain had given her. Not safety, not ease, the knowledge of herself. Gideon's hand found hers on the porch rail. Not briefly this time. He held on. His hand was rough and warm, and she'd learned the particular weight of it over months until it felt as familiar as her own. "We should start the fall supply run before the weather changes," he said. "I know. 3 weeks, probably. I've already started the list." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I was thinking we could add lumber, if the East Flat is going to keep growing." "I put lumber on the list," she said. She felt him looking at her profile. "You put it on the list," he said. "Last week." She turned to look at him. "I thought the same thing, about the East Flat." He held her gaze and she held his, and between them was something that didn't need language because they'd been building the language for it all year. In ledger columns and midnight vigils and arguments about ribs and the slow hard work of two broken people deciding, day by day, that they weren't going to stay broken. "Good," he said. She turned back to the mountain. He stood beside her. Below them, the new families were doing the things people did at the end of a day, banking fires, putting up animals, moving toward the warmth and light of their own homes. The work of living, which was ordinary and essential and had its own beauty if you looked at it right. She had nearly died in a snowdrift in January. She had said yes to a stranger in the dark. She had stitched a wound by firelight in a blizzard and found a document at 2 a.m. and learned to read the weather coming in a sky she hadn't known before. None of it had been smooth. None of it had been guaranteed. The grief was still real, and the work was still hard, and winter was coming again with all its demands. And she was still, on some days, figuring out who she was in this life that had grown up around her unexpected as spring. But she was here. She had built something that lasted. And the mountain that had tested her, that had taken everything it could take, was hers now in the way only things you've genuinely earned can ever be. Eliza Cross stood on her porch in the September light and breathed in the cold, clean air coming off the peaks, and she stayed there until the sun went down behind the western ridge and the first stars came out above the tree line. Then she went inside. The fire was going. Dinner needed making. There was a letter to write and a supply list to finish and a life to keep building, the same as every day, which was enough, which was everything. She closed the door behind her. The mountain held the dark, the same as it always had, but this time there were lights in the windows.
Fuck. I'm too fat to make it across the fucking thing! Oh my god, he's got my fucking stream open, man. Wrong game. Oh, good comms, Corvus. Corvus, do you wanna play?
He's dead. He screamed so fucking loud. Holy shit.
I can, but I probably won't talk.
Dude, I tried to jump on the fucking railing and missed.
How many people can we have in a game? So I was going to beat him.
If you do
What about
want,
Zerty?
have a
Zerty,
phone
can you
with other
play?
people.
Zerty.
Zerty
I don't have
can
my mic on me.
definitely play.
Zerty. Zerty, you have a mic, so you've been designated.
We could do mods and get like fucking 8 people in here. It's crazy.
How does Ben know?
I know.
Wyan. Let's restart. Hold on. Get Wyan in here. Oh fuck, wrong file. Stupid, stupid. Give me a minute. How long is a minute, Zerty? How long is a minute? Do I have Zerty friended? I don't think I do. I have to check something out in a game. What does that mean? And install the game. Oh, you have to buy the fucking game?
Welcome to your first day on the job.